Hello, and welcome to a review of constitutional conflicts throughout American history. As you review for the AP exam, this doesn't necessarily have to do with constitutional conflicts, but I wanted to let you know that this is how the College Board creates the exam. They use these 9 time periods and they pull a certain number of questions from each of those time periods. And you can see there are some time periods that are weighted a little bit more heavily. So for example, the 19th and 20th centuries are weighted a bit more heavily than the colonial period, for example. So as you're studying for the AP exam, you might want to keep this in mind, and you might want to focus particularly on those time periods that are weighted more heavily on the multiple choice portion of the exam. This doesn't have any bearing on the essay portion of the exam. This is only for the multiple choice portion of the exam. So the focus of this review session is constitutional conflicts. One of the objectives that the College Board has laid out for the AP U.S. history class, one of the objectives that they would like you to be able to complete on the AP exam, is to explain how interpretations of the Constitution and debates over rights, liberties, and definitions of citizenship have affected American values, politics, and society. And so that's what this review session is going to focus on, those interpretations of the Constitution and debates over rights, liberties, and definitions of citizenship. Before we start talking about the Constitution, I want to clear up any confusion. A lot of students mix up the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So just to clear up any confusion, the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. The Declaration of Independence was a document that justified American independence from Great Britain. It was more of a philosophical document explaining why the United States wanted independence from Great Britain, or why they felt that they were justified in declaring their independence. It's in the Declaration that we find quotes like, "All men are created equal," beginning that idea of egalitarianism in the United States, and where we find that idea that the government gets its power from the consent of the governed, this idea of popular sovereignty. The people are the seat of the power, and that's where the government really gets its power, because the people allow the government to govern them. So the Declaration is more of ideas, whereas the Constitution is structural. The Constitution created the government of the United States. The Constitution lays out the legal structure of the government, what powers each branch of government has, how they are allowed to use those powers, what they can and cannot do, that sort of thing. The Constitution was created in 1787. It created the U.S. government. It starts off with the preamble that says, "We the people, in order to establish a more perfect union," and it has the amendments added to it. So amendments are part of the Constitution, and that includes the Bill of Rights, which are our first 10 amendments. And you absolutely need to know what those amendments are. You need to know what rights are guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, not only for the AP exam, but you'll see some of those on the EOC as well. So the way that I've structured this review is I've taken concepts that were written by the College Board, concepts that are laid out sort of like standards for the AP U.S. history class that teachers are expected to teach to their students, and that students will be tested on the AP exam. So at the blue part of the screen are those concepts that are laid out by the College Board. And I've chosen all of the concepts that have to do with either the creation of the Constitution or debates over the Constitution over time. So we'll start with this first concept. American political leaders created new constitutions and declarations of rights that articulated the role of the state and federal governments while protecting individual liberties and limiting both centralized power and excessive popular influence. So the College Board wants us to understand that when the United States gained independence, both the states and the federal government created these constitutions to establish the governments of those states and the government of the United States, and that those governments were attempting to protect individual liberties and limit both centralized power and excessive popular influence. So we'll look at how the Constitution did these things. At the 1787 Constitutional Convention, our political leaders created a government to replace the Articles of Confederation. Remember that the Articles of Confederation were too weak. They created a very weak central government that wasn't able to effectively manage the states. The states had too much power. They were doing things on their own. It created chaos. It was very difficult to organize the states economically and politically. And so our political leaders realized that we needed a stronger federal government. And so the Constitutional Convention replaced the Articles of Confederation with the new Constitution. And that new Constitution was focused on protecting individual liberties and limiting both centralized power and excessive popular influence. So let's talk about how the Constitution tried to limit centralized power. The Constitution wanted to create a stronger central government, but our political leaders were still very afraid of creating a central government that would be too powerful, a central government that would be more like the tyrannical government of Great Britain that they had just gotten rid of. So they certainly wanted to continue to limit centralized power, and so they came up with a system of federalism. Federalism shares powers between the state and the central government. So federalism is that balance of power between the state and federal government. The fact that the federal government has some powers, but then some powers are also left to the states. And so that was a way to create a stronger federal government, but still maintain some powers for the states. Another way of limiting centralized power was by separating the powers into three branches. The separation of powers created our three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. And then checks and balances are the powers that each branch has over the other branches, so that each branch can make sure that the other branches are following the rules. An example of checks and balances would be the president's ability to veto legislation created by Congress. So that's an example of an executive check on the legislative branch. Another example of checks and balances would be judicial review, the idea that the Supreme Court has the ability to interpret the constitutionality of legislation, and so that is a judicial check on the legislative branch. One power that the legislative branch has for checks and balances is the ability to approve appointments made by the president. And so when the president appoints a Supreme Court justice or a cabinet member, the Senate has the option of approving or not approving those appointments. And so that's one way that the legislative branch can check the executive branch. In addition to limiting the central power, the Constitution of the United States also attempted to limit popular influence. Remember that popular refers to the people, and so what they were trying to do is essentially make sure that people didn't have too much power because they wanted to avoid mob rule. They wanted to avoid making politics into a popularity contest, and so they were afraid that if they gave people all of the power, the people wouldn't be able to use it wisely. And so republicanism is a good solution to this problem. Remember that republicanism is representative government. Rather than giving people all of the power, we give people the power to elect representatives, and then those representatives have the power to make political decisions and actually make things happen. So the people don't necessarily have the power to make political decisions. They only have the power to elect their representatives, and then their representatives will make decisions. And many of our political leaders, our founding fathers who created the Constitution, believed that not every man was capable of making good decisions in the government. So they believed that republicanism would solve that problem of excessive popular influence. Another solution to this problem of excessive popular influence was the Electoral College. Remember that the Electoral College is the body of representatives that actually elects the president. Our popular vote doesn't actually matter. It's the Electoral College that matters. Something that we saw in this election last year, in the 2016 election, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College and therefore was elected President of the United States. The next concept reads, Through negotiation, collaboration, and compromise, delegates from the states proposed a constitution that created a limited but dynamic central government embodying federalism and providing for a separation of powers between its three branches. Now, those are terms that we discussed on the previous slide. We're still talking about the creation of the Constitution here. Remember that federalism is that separation of powers between the state and federal government. The state and federal government share some powers and also have separate powers. And we talked about the separation of powers between the three branches of government at the federal level: executive, judicial, and legislative. But another key part of this key concept here is the idea that a lot of compromise went into the creation of the Constitution. And this is important when we're talking about constitutional conflicts. The Constitution itself was created with conflict. The delegates from all the states couldn't agree on exactly what type of government they wanted. And so there was a lot of compromise that went into the Constitution in its creation. So we couldn't even create a government without conflict. And so this kind of previews the idea that we're going to continually argue over what this Constitution means and how it should be interpreted. One example of the compromise that went into the Constitution was a compromise between large states and small states. The compromise between large states and small states was known as the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise dealt with representation in Congress for each state. The issue was large states wanted a Congress that would be represented based on population. So large states with larger populations wanted more representatives for the large states and fewer representatives for the small states. Of course, that would benefit large states politically. The small states, however, wanted equal representation for each state because that would give them a little bit more leverage against those larger states. So the compromise was to create a bicameral legislature, meaning a legislature with two houses. And of course, our two houses of Congress are the Senate, which has equal representation, which is what the small states wanted, and the House of Representatives, which has representation based on population, which is what the large states wanted. So the Great Compromise, sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise, gave us a little bit of both, satisfying both the large states and the small states. The next key concept that deals with the creation of the Constitution and these conflicts that went into the Constitution deals with the conflict of slave states versus free states. This was also something that our political leaders needed to compromise over in order to create a Constitution that was acceptable to all the states. And so these are the two compromises that dealt with that issue of slave states versus free states and what each interest wanted. The 3/5 compromise dealt with the representation of the slave states in Congress. That was the 3/5 compromise. Said that 3/5 of the slave population could be counted toward the general population in determining how many representatives would represent that state in Congress. So in other words, slave states got the advantage here because they were able to count some of their slaves toward the population and use that to gain more representatives in Congress. This did not, however, provide any representation or political rights for those slaves. This simply was a way to provide more power for the whites in that state who could vote. The other compromise that we saw regarding slavery in the Constitution was the slave trade compromise. The slave trade compromise allowed the United States Congress to discuss the prohibition of the international slave trade after 1808. And when that year got there, when 1808 happened, the Congress did prohibit the international slave trade. So it was a sign that there were many people in our country in the 1780s who already wanted to stop importing slaves from Africa. But again, the slave states sort of get a victory here. They say, well, let's wait 20 years. And so they had 20 more years to import slaves from Africa before Congress banned the international slave trade, that importation of slaves from Africa. So those are the two compromises that went in. And remember that the purpose of compromise was to be able to create a government that all states could agree on. Because if they couldn't create a government that all states could agree on, they might have broken up into separate countries, and that would have made them more susceptible to invasion from the other colonial powers, Great Britain and Spain, who still had territories in North America at the time. The next key concept deals with the conflict over ratification of the Constitution. So even before the Constitution was ratified, again, there were conflicts over this document, this government for the United States. Anti-Federalists opposing ratification battled with Federalists whose principles were articulated in the Federalist Papers, primarily written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Federalists ensured the ratification of the Constitution by promising the addition of a Bill of Rights that enumerated individual rights and explicitly restricted the powers of the federal government. So I really don't have any additional information to add here. This gives you all of the details that you need. The Anti-Federalists opposed ratification. The Federalists supported it. The way that the Federalists were able to achieve ratification was through the Federalist Papers, which convinced many Americans to change their minds and ratify the Constitution, and also by promising the addition of a Bill of Rights, which was tacked onto the Constitution after it was ratified. And of course, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And again, you want to make sure that you know what those 10 amendments do, because you're likely to see some of those amendments either on the AP exam or the EOC exam at the end of the year. Once the Constitution was ratified, that didn't mean that the conflict was ended and everybody was satisfied with the document. After the ratification of the Constitution, the conflicts that arise are conflicts over different interpretations of the Constitution. And our first presidents, President Washington and then President John Adams, had the ability to make decisions on how they interpreted the Constitution. And so in those early presidencies, our presidents were setting precedents that put the principles of the Constitution into practice. So the decisions that were made by these first presidents helped later generations interpret the Constitution. And so some of the precedents that were set by Washington include the Bank of the U.S., which Washington signed into law. There was a conflict over the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, and this actually contributed to the first political parties. Hamilton, the first Secretary of Treasury, created the Bank of the United States, but Jefferson, the first Secretary of State, rejected the Bank of the United States, believed that it was unconstitutional, and tried to get Congress to reject the idea of creating a Bank of the United States. But ultimately, Hamilton won. Congress voted to charter the Bank of the United States, and Washington signed this into law. And so that was one precedent set by the Washington administration, that the Bank of the United States was constitutional. Another precedent set by the Washington administration was his neutrality proclamation, which declared the United States would be neutral in the war between Britain and France. And he reiterated his position here in the farewell address, essentially offering advice to the United States that they shouldn't join any permanent foreign alliances, that they especially shouldn't be involved in European conflict. And the reason why Washington did this is because Europe was constantly at war, and the United States was trying to build a solid foundation so that their country could last, and they wanted to make sure that they focused on themselves rather than other people's problems. But the way that this set a precedent was that it confirmed the executive branch's ability to steer foreign policy. The Constitution gives the president the ability to create foreign policy through the State Department and through his own decisions. And so Washington's neutrality proclamation and farewell address confirmed that idea that the executive ought to be the number one in making foreign policy decisions. Another precedent set by the Washington administration was his response to the Whiskey Rebellion. When the Whiskey Rebellion broke out in Pennsylvania, Washington responded by gathering federal troops and marching those federal troops into Pennsylvania. This illustrated the strength of the federal government, and it showed us that the way that Washington interpreted the Constitution, the federal government had much more power than the state governments. which is also something that's going to lead to the creation of the first political parties. During the Adams administration, he will also take actions that set certain precedents. In the Adams administration, during the Quasi-War, that conflict with France, his Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were meant to silence the Democratic Republicans who were criticizing Adams's foreign policy choices. In the Alien and Sedition Acts, Adams was the first president to limit civil liberties in an effort to protect national security. And so there is this idea of a balance between liberty and order. Adams believed that it was necessary to limit liberties in order to provide order and stability in our foreign policy and protect the national security of the United States. Of course, the Democratic Republicans aren't going to believe that interpretation of the Constitution, and they're going to respond with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So this next key concept deals with the creation of those political parties. And as I kind of implied on the last slide, the two political parties were created as a result of the constitutional conflicts that occurred during the Washington and Adams administrations. So the key concept reads, political leaders in the 1790s took a variety of positions on issues such as the relationship between the national government and the states, economic policy, foreign policy, and the balance between liberty and order. This led to the formation of political parties, most significantly the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And so here I have some characteristics of each party, and this key concept says that these parties took a variety of positions on issues such as the relationship between national government and the states. So if we look down at our characteristics, the Federalists believed that there should be more power to the federal government, and the Democratic Republicans believed that more powers should be given to the states and individuals. So those are the two different positions that each party took on that particular issue. Now, because of this, the Federalists interpreted the Constitution with a loose or broad interpretation. Hamilton and the Federalists used what we call the elastic clause in the Constitution. Sometimes we also call it the necessary and proper clause. It essentially gives Congress the power to do whatever is necessary and proper to fulfill their other duties that are enumerated or listed in the Constitution. So the Federalists interpreted the Constitution in such a way that it would give more power to the federal government. On the other hand, the Democratic Republicans believed that more power should be given to states and individuals, and so they interpreted the Constitution much more strictly, and they interpreted the Constitution in a way that said if the Constitution doesn't actually give the federal government power to do something, the federal government doesn't have that power, and that power should be reserved to the states, as the 10th Amendment said. And so this was the primary issue that divided the two political parties, and people fell into one party or the other based on their belief of who should have more power, the national government and the states. And again, it was that belief, who should have more power, that led them to interpret the Constitution in different ways. And so if you believe that the federal government should have more power, you were going to interpret the Constitution loosely or broadly, as the Federalists did. If you believe that the states should have more power, you were going to have a more strict interpretation of the Constitution, as the Republicans did. The next issue that is listed in the key concept is economic policy. So these parties also had differing positions on economic policy. And this goes back to the issue of the national bank. And again, the Federalists, led by Hamilton, had that loose interpretation of the Constitution, and so they believed that the national bank was constitutional. They argued that it was necessary and proper for Congress to create a national bank. On the other hand, the Jeffersonians, the Republicans, argued that the national bank was unconstitutional. So that was their primary difference on economic policy. The next issue listed in the key concept is foreign policy. And in foreign policy, the primary difference was that the Federalists were more likely to favor Britain, and the Democratic Republicans were more likely to favor France. And the reason for this is that the Federalists were primarily merchants, and they favored good trade relations with Great Britain. Britain was a better trade partner because that had already been established under the mercantilism of the colonies. The reason the Democratic Republicans favored France is because France was going through their own revolution and trying to create a democratic government like the United States. And so the Democratic Republicans believed that we should support that government that was going against monarchy just like we were. And so this led to a difference in how they interpreted the Constitution and how the United States should respond to foreign policy. And then, of course, our two first presidents leaned more federalist, and so the foreign policy that we see under those first two presidents is going to be much more favorable toward Britain than France. The next issue that the two political parties differed on in the 1790s was the balance between liberty and order. And this again became a constitutional issue, and we're going to see this same constitutional conflict between liberty and order again and again in times when America's national security is threatened. Our government sometimes restricts liberties in order to maintain order. So examples of this we discussed on the previous slide. Examples of this would be Washington's actions in the Whiskey Rebellion and Adams's Alien and Sedition Acts. In both of these cases, Washington and Adams used the federal government to restrict liberty, but to maintain order. And the Democratic Republicans believed that this was an abuse of federal power, and that's why James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions arguing that the states had the ability to nullify federal laws that were unconstitutional. So the Democratic Republicans argued that the Alien and Sedition laws were unconstitutional because they were an overreach of federal power. And again, that goes back to this strict interpretation of the Constitution, because Jefferson and Madison, the Democratic Republicans, believed that there should be more power to states and individuals. And so that's going to influence how they interpret that balance between liberty and order. The next key concept reads, the Supreme Court decisions established the primacy of the judiciary in determining the meaning of the Constitution and asserted that federal laws took precedence over state laws. When it says the primacy of the judiciary in determining the meaning of the Constitution, that's a fancy way of talking about judicial review. Judicial review is the idea that the Supreme Court has the ability to decide whether or not congressional laws are constitutional. And this power came about because of the court case Marbury v. Madison. That was the first court case in which the Supreme Court declared a congressional law unconstitutional. And so the Supreme Court basically took that power for themselves by declaring a law unconstitutional. They set the precedent that was the responsibility of the Supreme Court. And so after Marbury versus Madison, it became accepted that if there was a constitutional conflict, the arbiter, the judge of that constitutional conflict would be the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would have the power to decide finally, make the final decision which side was right in those constitutional conflicts. So as we move forward, during this period where Chief Justice John Marshall was on the court and after, we're going to see the Supreme Court sort of deciding these constitutional conflicts. In the period of the Marshall Court, Supreme Court decisions asserted that federal laws took precedence over state laws. So two examples of that we have are Gibbons v. Ogden and McCulloch v. Maryland, where the Marshall Court decided that states do not have the power to regulate interstate commerce and states do not have the power to tax the national bank. And so in both cases, the Marshall Court gave these powers only to Congress and not to the states. So Marshall definitely sided with the Federalist Party and interpreted the Constitution in such a way that gave the federal government more power than the states. And these decisions set that precedent so that later Supreme Court decisions are often more likely to support that interpretation of the Constitution. Although we'll see that our interpretation of the Constitution changes over time. Now, another interesting thing about McCulloch v. Maryland is that by saying that the states cannot tax the national bank, this decision implied that the national bank was constitutional. Remember, that was one of the first constitutional conflicts, whether or not the bank was constitutional. And here, the Marshall Court decided that it was constitutional. And we'll see that later on, some people are going to disagree with that, and opinions will change. By the 1820s and 1830s, new political parties arose. The Democrats, led by Andrew Jackson, and the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, that disagreed about the role and powers of the federal government and issues such as the national bank, tariffs, and federally funded internal improvements. So here again, we're starting to see our second party system, and what creates these party systems are constitutional conflicts. Because these groups of people disagree about the role and powers of the federal government, they form different parties and advocate different interpretations of the Constitution. So in this situation, the Whigs argued that the federal government should have more power, and the Democrats argued that more power should be given to the states. And so when they disagreed about the issues such as the national bank, the Whigs, who believed that there should be more power to the federal government, believed that we should renew the national bank. When they disagreed on tariffs, the Whigs, who believed that there should be more power to the federal government, agreed that the government had the ability to issue protective tariffs. And when there was a discussion or debate over federally funded internal improvements, again, the Whigs, who believed that there should be more power to the federal government, believed that the federal government had the power to build that infrastructure. So the Whigs ended up supporting what we call Henry Clay's American system, which believed that the federal government had the ability and responsibility to do all three of those things, whereas Democrats did not believe or support the American system. Ultimately, the Democrats would achieve greater power in government. With the election of Andrew Jackson, the Democrats achieved power within the executive branch of government. And we're going to see some constitutional conflicts in the Jackson administration. One of those constitutional conflicts was the nullification crisis, when South Carolina argued that the tariffs passed in the late 1820s and early 1830s were unconstitutional, and they revived the argument that Jefferson and Madison put in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing that the states had the ability to declare laws unconstitutional and then nullify those laws and not follow those laws. Now, this one is an interesting one because despite the fact that Jackson is a Democrat and agrees that there should be more power to the states, in this particular instance, Jackson does not support South Carolina's right to nullify the tariff. And Jackson actually threatened to respond in a similar way that Washington did in the Whiskey Rebellion. Jackson threatened to march federal forces down there and force South Carolina to pay the tariff. But he didn't have to do that because Congress eventually compromised and lowered the tariff, and South Carolina agreed to pay the tariff eventually. But that is one instance where this constitutional conflict, this disagreement over what is or is not constitutional, created tension between the states and the federal government. And it was sort of a preview of what we would see in 1861 after the election of Abraham Lincoln. Again, South Carolina is going to argue for nullification, and then they're even going to argue that they have the right to secede, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Another constitutional issue in the Jackson administration was the bank veto. President Jackson vetoed a renewal of the Bank of the United States, arguing that he believed the Bank of the United States was unconstitutional because it benefited certain populations over others. It benefited merchants and bankers over farmers and other Americans. Now, despite the fact that the Supreme Court had already decided that the Bank of the United States was constitutional, Jackson believed that it was his executive power to disobey the Supreme Court and veto the bank anyway. And in fact, after Andrew Jackson vetoed the bank, we never would again have a national bank after that. The third constitutional issue that occurs in the Jackson administration is the issue of Indian removal. The Supreme Court under John Marshall had already decided that Native Americans shouldn't be removed and they should be dealt with according to treaties that had already been signed, and those treaties should not be broken with the Native Americans. But Jackson, just like with the bank veto, again said that it was his executive power to sign the Indian Removal Act into legislation and enforce the Indian Removal Act because that's what the people wanted. So in both the bank veto and the Indian removal, Jackson essentially argued that the people felt that these issues were unconstitutional, and therefore, no matter what the Supreme Court decided, Jackson was going to do what the people wanted because that's what the president was supposed to do. In the decade of the 1850s, slavery became the largest constitutional conflict. And in that time period, the courts made a variety of attempts to resolve the issue of slavery in the territories, including the Dred Scott decision, but these ultimately failed to reduce conflict. And in fact, the Dred Scott decision is unique in American history because remember that in the early 19th century, under the Marshall Court, the court had made decisions giving the federal government more power and reducing the power of the state governments. But in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court actually went in the opposite direction. And the Dred Scott decision said that Congress did not have the power to prohibit slavery in any states or territories. And in fact said that it was the states' right to decide for themselves whether or not they would have slavery in their territories. And this is actually an interesting decision. Like I said, it goes against earlier precedents set by the court. But ultimately, just about 8 years later, the 13th Amendment would render this useless anyway. Congress would eventually decide to prohibit slavery in all the territories. And so Congress and Abraham Lincoln, our president in the 1860s, decided to go against the Supreme Court in Dred Scott and go ahead and prohibit slavery anyway. And of course, in order to prohibit slavery, Congress would have to change the Constitution. And so amendments were added to the Constitution to abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, while the 14th and 15th Amendments granted African Americans citizenship, equal protection under the laws, and voting rights. This led to a split in the women's rights movement, which was both emboldened and divided over the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, because the 15th Amendment to the Constitution particularly gave men suffrage, but did not address women's suffrage. And the 14th Amendment protected the equality of citizens regardless of their race or previous condition of servitude, but didn't say anything about the equality of people according to their sex. So there were some women who were disturbed by the 14th and 15th Amendments, but regardless, these were great steps forward for African Americans. One easy way to remember these amendments, and these three amendments are incredibly important, one easy way to remember them is by remembering free citizens vote. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves, the 14th guaranteed their rights as citizens, the 15th allowed the men to vote. But unfortunately, adding those amendments to the Constitution did not stop constitutional conflict over the rights of African Americans. And in fact, as this key concept reads, segregation, violence, Supreme Court decisions, and local political tactics progressively stripped away African American rights, but the 14th and 15th Amendments eventually became the basis for court decisions upholding civil rights in the 20th century. So we'll get to the 20th century a little bit later in our review, but I wanted to focus on these Supreme Court decisions that stripped away African American rights. In fact, just like the Dred Scott case before the Civil War, the civil rights cases and the slaughterhouse cases during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction gave powers to the states and essentially gave the states the ability to segregate their society between the races and to discriminate against African Americans. In fact, we also see a similar shift in the Supreme Court's decisions with Plessy v. Ferguson. So during and after Reconstruction, the Supreme Court actually gave more power to the states to discriminate and segregate and went against what Congress was trying to do to protect African American civil rights with the 14th and 15th Amendments. The Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson that upheld racial segregation helped to mark the end of most of the political gains African Americans made during Reconstruction. Of course, Plessy v. Ferguson established this precedent of separate but equal, which led to the creation of Jim Crow laws in the South, which would stand until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. One of the first constitutional conflicts that our original political parties had was that conflict between liberty and order. If you remember, during the Quasi-War, the Adams administration passed the Alien and Sedition Acts to maintain order, but those acts also restricted our liberties. We see that again happening during World War I, and then we'll even see that again during World War II, and really during most wars in American history. This key term says, official restrictions on freedom of speech grew during World War I as increased anxiety about radicalism led to a Red Scare and attacks on labor activism and immigrant culture. The best example of this during World War I is the Supreme Court case Schenck versus the United States, which was a decision on the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Particularly the Sedition Act. But the Espionage and Sedition Acts were passed during World War I to limit negative speech, negative press about the war movement. And so there was a man by the name of Schenck who was publishing anti-draft pamphlets, and he was convicted under the Sedition Act, and he argued that this was a limitation of free speech. And free speech is, of course, protected by the First Amendment. And so he argued that the Sedition Act basically went against the First Amendment. However, in this case, Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court decided that speech which presents a danger to the nation is not protected by the First Amendment. And so the Supreme Court decided that in this case, Schenck's anti-draft speech presented a danger to the nation, and therefore he was justifiably punished under the Sedition Act. And so again, this is that balance between liberty and order. In World War I, the United States government decided that it was okay to take away some of our liberty in order to maintain order and support for the war effort. There was a similar case in World War II. In World War II, please remember that FDR issued an executive order to intern Japanese Americans during the war. And in that case, the Supreme Court decided, in the case of Korematsu versus the United States, that again, it was constitutional for the United States to take away the liberty of Japanese Americans and force them to live in these internment camps in order to protect the national security of the United States and maintain order during wartime. In this case, the Supreme Court said that it was a wartime necessity to intern Japanese Americans, and that was perfectly okay. Coming back to the issue of African American civil rights and that constitutional conflict between the states wanting to discriminate against African Americans and the Congress trying to protect the rights of African Americans, in the 1950s and 60s, that African American civil rights movement used the 14th and 15th Amendment to gain achievements and greater civil rights. One of the first court cases to do that was Brown v. Board, and Brown v. Board occurred in 1954. And in that case, Chief Justice Earl Warren and his court decided that separate is inherently unequal. And so this case reversed that Plessy v. Ferguson decision. So by arguing that separate is inherently unequal, the Warren Court reversed that Plessy decision and essentially opened the door for legal challenges to all of those Jim Crow segregation laws in southern states. And so this was essentially the beginning of the end of legal segregation in the southern states. From this point on, the civil rights movement was able to achieve other successes like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which said that discrimination was prohibited. Discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and sex was prohibited, and the states and private institutions could not discriminate on those reasons, on those factors. And so these actions, the Brown v. Board decision and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, finally protected the 14th Amendment rights of African Americans. In fact, under the Warren Court, we get a series of Supreme Court decisions which expanded civil rights and individual liberties. And so in the 1950s and 60s, we see a lot of controversial Supreme Court decisions, a lot of conflicts over that interpretation of the Constitution and whether or not it really does protect these civil rights and individual liberties. The key concept continues by saying, in the 1960s, conservatives challenged liberal laws and court decisions and perceived moral and cultural decline, seeking to limit the role of the federal government and enact more assertive foreign policies. So the idea here was that many conservatives believed that the federal government was becoming too powerful because of the civil rights movement, and these decisions that were made by the Supreme Court, which expanded individual liberties, many people were afraid that this would create disorder within the United States. And so again, this is really about that controversy over liberty versus order. In Griswold v. Connecticut, the Supreme Court decided that women had a right to contraception. Essentially, the state could not prohibit the use of contraception among married couples, and this was based on the right to privacy. And so it opened up this door of the right to privacy, and other Supreme Court cases later, Roe v. Wade, for example, were decided based on this right to privacy. Another important case in the Warren Court was Miranda v. Arizona, which protected the rights of the accused, the rights of citizens accused of crimes. And many Americans argued that Miranda v. Arizona and other similar cases took rights away from law enforcement and actually weakened our law enforcement and were going to lead to more criminal activity in the United States. And so there was actually a movement against this, a movement among people to limit our liberties in order to maintain order on the streets, in order to reduce crime on the streets. But the Warren Court argued that liberty was more important. And so this kind of goes against the decisions that were made during World War I and World War II. And the Warren Court here prioritized liberty over order. Another decision that we got expanding the civil rights of Americans was Baker v. Carr, and Reynolds v. Sims was a very similar decision. They both established this precedent of one man, one vote, and that dealt with apportionment of legislative districts, the way that legislative districts are divided. Both of those cases essentially established that every legislative district ought to have equal population. So you can't have one district that has 10,000 people in it and then another district that has 2,000 people in it. You need to redraw both of those districts so that they will both have 6,000 people in them so that the people can be equally represented. Another example of protection of individual liberty was Tinker v. Des Moines, in which the Warren Court protected free speech. In that case, they protected students' rights to wear black armbands in protest of the Vietnam War. And so again, that's a very different decision than they made during World Wars I and II, where they decided that it was a wartime necessity to restrict liberty in order to maintain order. Here, the Warren Court says that liberty is more important. The decision New York v. Sullivan protected free press in that time of war and conflict, and Engel v. Vitale protected freedom of religion. And that was one of the earliest cases that essentially established that prayer did not belong in public schools, and we ought to keep that separation of church and state in our public schools in order to protect the rights of people who belong to other religions besides Protestant religions, and in order to protect the rights of people who don't affiliate with any religion. The 1970s saw growing clashes between conservatives and liberals over social and cultural issues, the power of the federal government, race, and movements for greater individual rights. So one thing that I want to point out is that the conflicts that we have over the Constitution are the same conflicts over time. The first political parties were fighting over the power of the federal government. The first political parties were fighting over individual rights and whether or not those individual rights should be protected. So these are the same issues that we're discussing again and again and again. In the 1970s, two big examples that we see are Roe v. Wade and the University of California versus Bakke. Roe v. Wade is the decision that legalized abortion, essentially mandating that states could not prohibit abortion. They could limit abortion, but they could not fully prohibit it. And it was based on that right to privacy that was established in the Griswold case under the Warren Court. And so Roe v. Wade expanded individual rights in the tradition of the Warren Court, just like the Warren Court decisions had. On the other hand, the University of California versus Bakke scaled back affirmative action in colleges and universities. And affirmative action was policies where universities would have racial quotas for acceptance. They would set a quota, a certain number of students from every race that they wanted to admit, and many whites argued that this was reverse discrimination. Whites were being discriminated against in order to provide more opportunities for people of color. And so the Supreme Court agreed that this actually limited the individual rights of whites in favor of rights of other colors. And so the court decided that although race can be a factor in admittance policies, those quotas were unconstitutional because you can't simply say that we have to admit so many people of this color, etc. And finally, moving into the 21st century, the very last key concept that deals with constitutional conflicts says the war on terrorism sought to improve security within the United States, but also raised questions about the protection of civil liberties and human rights. And again, this is that same question of liberty versus order. After 9/11, Americans became very fearful for our national security, and many Americans were actually willing to give up civil liberties in order to protect the security and safety of the United States. And so George W. Bush, who was president when the 9/11 terrorist attack happened, and his Congress passed the Patriot Act, which allowed the government to gather all kinds of intelligence information on American citizens. And so we essentially gave up our privacy in order to help the government catch these terrorists. And the government did a lot of things to these terrorists that often violated the human rights of these terrorists. And so we saw a lot of support for these actions by the Bush administration in the early years right after 9/11, but as time went on and as time separated people from 9/11 and we got a little further down the road, we started realizing that maybe those actions taken by the federal government were not justified, that maybe it wasn't worth it to give up our civil liberties in exchange for security. And so we saw 3 Supreme Court cases that actually took some of that power away from the Bush government, or the Bush administration. Rasul v. Bush allowed a British citizen detained at Guantanamo Bay to challenge his incarceration, to essentially go on trial and argue for his innocence, which with that right was not being given to some of those detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Hamdi versus Rumsfeld ruled that a U.S. citizen captured in Afghanistan and detained without charge or the right to see a lawyer had the right to a hearing, because those are rights that are given to American citizens by the Bill of Rights. And so those are very fundamental rights of American citizens, and those should be protected no matter where the citizen was captured. And Boumediene versus Bush affirmed the detainees' right to challenge their detention in U.S. courts. And so again, these all have to deal with the human rights of these suspected terrorists who were caught, and the Bush administration was not allowing them to challenge their detainment in court. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of their civil liberties and expanded their civil liberties as a result of these decisions. And so you can see that over time, we fight over the same issues. We have the same conflicts over the Constitution, but our interpretation of the Constitution changes back and forth over time. And in some periods of history, we give more power to the federal government. In some periods, we give more power to the state governments. In some periods, we are in favor of restricting liberty to maintain order, but in some time periods, we go the opposite direction. So we fluctuate back and forth, and that's the beauty of our Constitution, is that it can be interpreted differently over time, and that's one of the reasons why it has lasted over 200 years.